Everyone treats summer like it owes you happiness. Long days, pool parties, your best life on a loop. So what does it mean when you feel worse? The summer blues are real. It's why summer is one of the busiest stretches of the year for people starting therapy. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Growth therapy is for all the moments when you decide you want more support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach. It's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 36, Landscapes for the Dead Part 1, Tombs with a View. This is the first episode in a series about a subfield within archaeology that's known as landscape archaeology. In this episode, I want to start with what's called viewshed analyses, or also known as visibility studies, because these studies can help us to understand how people of our past viewed and interacted with the places where their ancestors were laid to rest. So without further ado, let's get started. Whenever most people are learning about a burial site, it's usually through the artifacts or the people that were buried there or the monumental architecture itself. We tend to get a lot of cultural context, but not a lot of broader landscape environmental context that goes along with the burial grounds and the tombs associated with them and what that means culturally. And that's where landscape archaeology comes in. It's a subfield that's specifically for studying the way people of the past would interact with the wider world around them. Things like how they shaped their natural environment, how their natural environment shaped them, and how and why people shaped their physical spaces from their homes and gardens to their settlements and even to full-on empires. The natural landscape around us impacts the way that we move through the world, and humans have also spent a long time impacting that landscape around us. So it's very hard to actually differentiate the human-created landscape and the natural landscape when it actually plays a huge factor in how we make most of our decisions. Landscape archaeology is also a study of more metaphorical environments, and it can be used to study things like networks across landscapes, political landscapes, that sort of metaphorical sense of the word. And because of so many things that are intertwined when it comes to our spaces and our places, there's a lot of interdisciplinary research that goes into landscape archaeology. So it isn't just your traditional archaeology. One of the biggest places where landscape archaeology pulls from is geophysical sciences and then also sociology. First, we're going to get into the geophysical sciences side of things with something that's called viewshed analyses. And these have been done before GIS software was available, but they had to be calculated by hand. GIS software has helped boost this type of research and landscape archaeology research on a whole because we can create the past landscape way better and way more accurately, and we can calculate lots of data points at once instead of manually calculating them. From what I understand, the original versions of trying to calculate these view sheds was a lot of boots on the ground work and doing a lot of physical surveying and calculating only a handful of points per paper. But now, thanks to technology, we can do a lot more. So viewshed analysis is where we take a look at what could be visible from a specific point based on the topography and plants and structures in the area at a specific point in time. It even allows us to actually input specific heights for the hypothetical viewer's eye level so that we can actually be accurate about what the average height person of that region would have been able to see whenever they were looking from that vantage point that we're trying to calculate. Viewshed analysis is used to study strategic places for things like hill forts or castles, things like that you would expect to have a sort of broad view of the area around it and be able to see various other points or lookout towers to identify that sort of thing. But when it's actually used to identify burial places or to study burial places, we can look at both what was seen from a specific burial and we can look at what other places along the landscape could see a specific burial. This can help us to identify things that were culturally important, sometimes things that are important just to a specific person if we're just looking at a specific burial, and it can also be used to help us understand how those burials played into the larger cultural consciousness. And we can see how it fit or didn't fit into a sacred landscape. First, let's explore Boyne in County Meath, Ireland. People have lived here for over 7,000 years in this valley, and as people interact with the landscape over time, they have identified sacred places in different spots that will take on different meanings for various reasons for lots of different periods. So everything that is there on the landscape now was not all there during the period when we're going to be talking about. So everything that we're focusing on is everything from the Neolithic period around 5,000 years ago. Boyne has some of the most famous Neolithic monuments in Western Europe. It's got passage tombs, standing stones, ring forts, hinges, petroglyphs, settlements, production sites, you name it. Any Neolithic structure you want, they've got it here at Boyne. There are over 90 known Neolithic structures in the area alone, and that's just known. All sorts of LiDAR surveys and excavations keep identifying more, so who knows how many are actually under the surface that we haven't found yet. And Boyne is especially famous for its 3 huge passage tombs, Newgrange, Knowth, and Dowth. They're also pretty famous for their celestial alignments, which I will go into later, but for now we're talking about their place within the physical landscape, which is, in my opinion, just as important to study as their astronomical alignments are. So these 3 massive tombs are up on hills, but it's a very rolling hill sort of area. There's not a large difference in elevation from the lowest point where the river is to the entrance of Newgrange. It's only a difference of about 30 meters or 100 feet, and Newgrange is the one at the highest elevation in the valley. So it's not going to be a dramatic difference in views. But what's interesting is that even though they are up on elevated places, these 3 passage tombs don't actually have grand panoramic views. Because of the way that the other hills roll and the river bends, you can't actually see much of the other monuments in the valley, and you can't see the river at all, which is odd because the river is actually such an important point of the entire valley. The River Boyne has actually been incredibly important to more than just Boyne in this valley. It's an incredibly important part of Irish history. People have lived along here for thousands and thousands of years, and lots of the most famous ancient monuments, Neolithic, and even historic points of interest or structures or events have all happened along the River Boyne. During the period when these three passage tombs were built, the River Boyne was also incredibly important, and it was being used a lot with these log boats, which are essentially dugout canoes that were carrying people and trade goods constantly. This was a main fishing, travel, and trade line all the way across Ireland, basically. The river was so important to the people who lived here for so long, it became a sacred focal point for all sorts of gatherings and rituals all along its banks. As I said, there's very many important sites along the river here, and it's been impressed into cultural memory for so long, it's even managed to be preserved in the bits of Irish folklore that have managed to survive into modern times. It's seen as a source of wisdom and as part of the origin story for one of Ireland's legendary heroes, Finn McCool. So as I said, it's a little bit weird that if you're creating something with a view, you wouldn't have an overview of the most important thing in that region, which is the River Boyne. So even though the tombs didn't seem to actually have that great of a viewpoint when it came to actually overlooking everything around them, many places on the landscape could see the tombs very well, and they could be seen very dramatically as one traveled along the River Boyne. So if you were in a log boat traveling down the River Boyne and you were coming from inland going towards the sea, you would get to a bend in the River Boyne where suddenly Knowth would be appearing on the landscape in front of you, and you would see it up until you turn another bend, and then Newgrange would appear on the landscape to your left. And then you would continue around a softer bend, and then all three, Knowth, Newgrange, and Dowth, would become visible. And then as you continue on, you would still get a view of all three for a while until Knowth would eventually fade into the hills and the trees. You would get to see Newgrange, and Dowth would be getting larger as you continue on. And then as you lose sight of Newgrange, you'd be coming right face on underneath Dowth on the landscape in front of you. And that's pretty impressive to me. I wish we could travel the landscape that same way in order to see that sort of dramatic reveal of the tombs as you're traveling by river. And then when you zoom out even further into the even wider Neolithic landscape of Ireland beyond Boyne, that's where the views from the different tombs that are here at Boyne become best. So the viewshed analysis shows that from all three of the passage tombs that are here, Dowth, Knowth, and Newgrange, you can see the Hill of Tara, which was also a very, very important point on the Neolithic landscape. And it's linked in folklore to basically being the core of the ancient kingdoms of way, way prehistoric Ireland. Within Boyne, there are other sacred sites that have a full view of all three cairns. Specifically, there's one area that has the highest concentration of confirmed ritual sites that is the best place on the ground that you can see all three cairns from. Boyne is a good example of these three megalithic tombs that were actually built to be seen more than seeing the immediate environment around them, but they all three look out to the heartland of Neolithic Ireland at the time, which was the Hill of Tara. Much more of the natural landscape was used than what was previously thought in order to create the views here, such as actually utilizing the river bends and the way the hills actually showed at specific points in order to choose where they were going to build these massive, very visible monuments. It wasn't simply a matter of picking the highest hills or picking the hills with the widest views. It was actually meant to make a statement and become part of that natural landscape in an even more dramatic way. These types of landscape analyses can also be applied to a much broader data set in order to help us identify changes that happened within the same culture, but over a different time period or even over distances. The next study is an example of how this data set from Western Norway and Iceland were used to compare shifts in traditions. In the pre-Christian Norse world, especially in Western Norway, there was a tradition of burying the dead in large, very visible cairns or burial mounds. Initially, they were always built near what the study calls the farm core and the home field. The farm core is the central area of the farm where the houses were, and in the home field was the farming area that was closest to the houses. In this case, the cairns had visibility of the core of the family farm, and the living had the near constant view of the cairns if they were outside. And so there would be this sense of the reminder of the ancestors and that the ancestors were watching over the family and the farmstead. By the late Iron Age in West Norway, the burial practice had shifted so that the home field was no longer prioritized. Ancestors were still buried very close to the farm core, but mainly along the main path that led there. The study refers to this as the welcome path because this would make the burials more visible to residents returning from their travels and any visitors that were approaching the farm core. So instead of being able to see these reminders of their ancestors throughout every moment of the day, they would no longer be able to see them when working in the fields unless they were at a very specific spot with a lucky vantage point. But anytime they went out a Viking or traveling or whatever, they would be returning home and seeing their ancestors as they're approaching their home. And their ancestors would be there to essentially stand guard over that welcome path where everybody was coming through. After this shift happened, Iceland was discovered, and many settlers fled Western Norway due to the growing conflict that we now refer to as the unification of Norway. It was when several regional sovereigns began fighting to eventually form the first unified monarchy of the country that we now call Norway. Those fleeing settlers brought with them a lot of their traditions, but they did make a few changes to their sacred burial landscape. So instead of prioritizing visibility to and from the farm core, almost none of the burials in Iceland during this period could see or be seen from the houses. They placed their burials near the furthest boundaries of the farm and almost always along main pathways instead, either waterways or inland roads depending on the most traveled routes, but they were always choosing the most traveled routes. They also stopped building huge cairns that would be visible from further away, and most of the burials were now under more modest monuments that were only visible if you were close to them, which has made it a bit harder for archaeologists to identify them as well. So now you have all of these settlers with no ancestral ties to the land like they did in Western Norway, essentially creating those ancestral ties and publicly marking their homestead boundaries with their dead, instead of just keeping their ancestors close to where only the family and visitors would see them. Whether or not you knew exactly whose family a burial belonged to, you could be walking along in the late 9th century, early 10th century Iceland and seeing those burials, and you would know that land is claimed. People do live here and have lived there for at least long enough to have dead to bury there. And so you're not going to stake your own land claim there without trying to do so with a fight. And this idea of burying the dead so that they could be very visible along major routes is not unique to the North Atlantic. Next, we'll take a look at Japan during the period that we refer to as the Kofun period. It's from about 300 CE to about 550 CE, a little bit later maybe. But during this period, people did choose to still bury their dead so that they were very visible and able to watch over tradeways, but it wasn't a culture-wide thing during this period. It was specific families that made this choice. Kofun are a type of ancient burial mound unique to Japan that are, when seen from above, they're keyhole-shaped because of the way that they're shaped with the circle, and then a larger rectangular shape coming out from that circle. And when you look at them from the landscape, they are very visible. They look like a specific shape but almost natural. Bit of uncanny valley with how it would kind of look like a normal hill, but not quite because of the nature of that entrance where the square part would end more suddenly than the rounded part. That square or rectangular part would have had a stage or a foundation area where there would have been rituals performed in honor of the deceased. So it would have been pretty visible from far away. These were built all over Japan, and they're generally associated with the influence of the Yamato clan because over time that architecture type tends to spread out along the same lines of influence as the clan itself. So it's possible that that architecture either originated with them or they liked it a lot and they spread it once they spread out. In the Shima Peninsula, which is in the Mie Prefecture in Japan, there's several kofun that overlook the sea where a lot of the ancient maritime trade routes would have come in and been able to establish trade between all of the islands of Japan as well as Korea during this period of the early Yamato spread of influence. This family, though, was not Yamato. The family buried here were the local governors who, for a very, very long period in Japanese history, were known for their seafaring and their maritime trade routes and holding a lot of power. The oldest and largest of the kofun here is called the Ojoka tumulus or the Ojoka Kofun, and it was built around the middle of the 5th century CE. It stands at the highest point of the peninsula overlooking the sea and is very visible as you're heading into the island by boat. The entrance to it, where everybody would have entered in order to pay their respects, overlooks the sea. So if you were to also stand there and look out from the point of view of the deceased, essentially, you would be looking out over the maritime trade routes. Within the tomb, a lot of very interesting things were found, including a very rare example of a clay pillow that was rested underneath the deceased's head as they were laid out for their burial. And there's lots and lots of mirrors that come from a very broad trade network that show just how powerful these people were. The other kofun around this one also show trade goods, but they aren't as lavish as this larger and older one. And after a while, when more forensic analyses became available and our technology advanced, people were able to study the remains that were found there and confirm that the person buried in the Ojoka Kofun is actually a woman. She would have been the matriarch of this clan, and she was very obviously very powerful and important. And she was buried in a way so that she would continue to watch over these very important trade routes that made this family so important for so long. Long after she was gone too, well into the 8th and 9th centuries, the family that ruled here from the Shima Peninsula still held ties to the original governors here, and they were still very important to all of the ruling classes of Japan during this time. The Ojoka Kofun remained an important landmark in the Shima Peninsula even after weather and human activity eroded the once very impressive structure down to where it just blends into the surrounding hillside. Ojoka means Princess Hill, which shows us that long after her identity and the details about her family had been lost to history, the matriarch of the Ojoka Kofun remained a part of the local cultural memory. And she was still there, overlooking everyone in the peninsula and overlooking that maritime route. There are many places around the world where the name of a part of the landscape has retained a piece of the people who once lived there but are now long gone. That's usually referred to as toponymics or cartoetymology, and I'll share more examples of that in a future episode because it sometimes does overlap with landscape archaeology. All of the locations that I've shared in this episode, from the passage tombs of Boyne that were designed to dramatically reveal themselves to the travelers along the river Boyne, to the Norse cairns in Iceland that were shifted to the welcome paths and farm boundaries instead of maintaining the same distance to the homesteads that they had on their original homelands, and the Ojoka Kofun, which rests high atop its peninsula to forever see and be seen from the important maritime trade route. These are just a handful of examples of what landscape archaeology can teach us about how our ancestors interacted with the world around them. In the next episode, we'll keep exploring how applying different aspects of landscape archaeology to burials can help us understand more about the people of the past, not just applying landscape archaeology to settlement patterns or trade routes. So thank you for listening to this episode. Until next time. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultura Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.